the chairman of it, Councillor Alan Schofield, and it's a warm welcome to everybody attending. I should remind members that they're reminded to speak slowly and clearly when they do speak, and when invited to do so, and that they are being watched through the webcast technology we have here. Please ensure that any mobile phones or other electronic devices are switched to silent throughout the duration of this meeting. I should mention that this meeting was intended to be solely in person, not in hybrid, but because of a particular request which I was able to find to support from Councillor Cooperthwaite, because he had to remain at home today because of some particular reasons there. Then we do have Councillor Cooperthwaite online, so to speak, joining us on the screen. So good to see you, and I hope you can hear us okay, Jeff. You realise though, if ever we come to have to vote on something, or rather if there's a split vote, then in any case voting doesn't apply to you. It's only the people in the room. Okay. And so welcome to members and officers, and in particular the committee's new members, County Councillors John Singleton to my right and Councillor Mark Clifford, sorry. And to Stuart Basnett from Grant Thornton, our external auditors, and those numerous or otherwise people watching the meeting through the webcast. Apologies for what we have one or two, don't we?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We've got County Councillor Maxwell Scott replacing County Councillor Shedwick just at this meeting. As you said, Chair, we've got County Councillor Cooperthwaite joining us online, together with Mike Jensen, Director of Investment, and we believe that County Councillor Berry is being delayed, but she's doing her best to get here as soon as she can.
Thank you, Paul. Chair. And sorry if I omitted to welcome you, in particular Councillor Maxwell Scott, in substituting for Councillor Shedwick this afternoon. Item 2 is constitution, membership and terms of reference of the committee. This normally comes to the committee at this time of the year to give us what the updated terms of reference are, so that we're all aware of it, or reminded of it for existing members, or otherwise for the new incoming members of the committee. So Appendix A goes through the terms of reference mainly, statement of purpose, and covering the various areas that the committee are responsible for overseeing and scrutinising if necessary. From an independent aspect, I should say as well, independent with a small I, that's the expectation of this committee, that we act in an independent manner. So it goes through governance, internal audit, external audit, through to Treasury management at the end of those terms of reference. So the committee is asked to know three things. The appointment of myself as chair, and Councillor John Singleton as deputy chair of this committee for 22-23 year, the membership of the committee, and its terms of reference. I take it we're okay to note that. Yes, Councillor.
Thank you, Chair. It's just an observation.
Yes.
We have 84 councillors, but only 8 members on this committee, so actually fractionally less than 10%. I know, looking at probably what's happened before, that seems to have been the case. But is that the right amount actually? For governance is such an important committee. Is 8 enough? That's just my observation, really, just my question.
I agree completely with you that this is an important committee. I recall 2 years ago, the officers might correct me if necessary, but I think at one time there were 8 members. That was reduced to 8 by the then leadership. It may have gone through the political governance working group, I'm not sure, but that's possibly something for that working group that I think still exists now, and the new arrangements. I'm sure that's going to meet regularly on an ad hoc basis, and perhaps quarterly. If any one of the groups has that concern, and you're free to raise that through your political group, obviously. But they could bring that to the attention and see what that political governance working group thinks about that. But it has been down to 8 for the last few years. Debatable whether any more members would add to the efficiency or otherwise of the committee. But I take your point about the numbers of full council. Do you have any comment on that, Chief Executive?
This is his area of expertise. He'll probably be able to
Yeah,
advise.
I mean, a similar question was actually brought up at the Political Governance Working Group about the size of the Political Governance Working Group, which I think also has 8 members. And I think Josh Minor explained in order to go to the next level, you're talking about jumping from 8 to quite a sizable number to maintain the balance. So it's something we could certainly put forward to the group. To go back to the Political Governance Working Group, but from what I can recall, I mean, you were jumping from 8 up to quite a substantial number to get the balance.
Yeah. The physical members free to take that forward under that route, but so far this particular committee hasn't had a concern itself about the numbers on it. It seems to have been working fairly well, if not very well. Okay. Next item 3 is if there's any pecuniary or non-pecuniary interest to disclose. Should say yes, Councillor.
Thank you, Chairman. Although I don't think it's overwhelmingly relevant to this, should display. I think it's both pecuniary and non-pecuniary interest as a director of Lancashire County Development Limited, and indeed chairman of its audit committee. On the safe side, I think.
Thank you. So that's been duly recorded. Agenda item 4, minutes of the last meeting of the committee held on the 25th of April. So it's a matter of proving these as a correct record. So I wanted to a couple of new members and a substitute member present. And strictly speaking, they could still propose or second these, even though they weren't present then. But ideally, thank you, Councillor Bailey. Anybody could second that? Well, I'll second that. So I think we're all in favour of that. Yes, thank you. And it's pleased to see Councillor Bailey. I told earlier that your train had been cancelled and you could be late.
Shortage of staff. It's very
So I'm pleased to see that you managed to get here.
Yeah.
Okay, moving on to agenda item 5, Treasury management activity in 21-22. Just a review, not just but an important review of Treasury management activity, borrowing, investment, cash management in the last financial year. And as we see on screen, waiting already, we've got the Council Director of Investment, Mike Jensen, ready to take us through this. And I'm sure, as you will welcome, if any members afterwards got any queries you might want to answer, he'd be very pleased to do so. So over to you, please, Mike.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, apologies for not being there in person. The family have come down with COVID again. So whilst I'm not testing positive at the moment, I thought it was judicious to not inflict that upon you. As you'll know, this is the regular annual report of Treasury activity in the financial year 21-22. I'll take the report as read, if I may, but want to draw out a few highlights. Specifically, 2021-22 was very much a year of 2 halves. Not quite halves, but 3 quarters and 1 quarter. The first 3 quarters of the year were a continuation on the previous 2 or 3 years worth of activity in the markets, a continued low interest rate, low inflation environment that led to generally slipping to historic lows in interest rates. And because of those actions, our activity in the capital markets managed to generate some additional income for the authority, as laid out on table. as laid out on that table on page. I don't think mine are numbered the same as yours, so mine's page 7, but we'll come back to that in a moment. The environment then changed dramatically just after the turn of the year, with at the beginnings of this developing inflation story. That was originally driven by a series of exogenous factors. So it's not a question of domestic inflation, it's a question of imported inflation, primarily in the first instance as the world economy began to rev up again after the COVID lockdowns had come to an end. And then the breakdown of various transportation and other issues out of China, with the locking down of the port of Shanghai. So a breakdown in the supply chain network for a load of manufacturers. Specifically highlighted would be the problem with electronic chip production, which in turn rolled onto electronics manufacture, and very specifically car manufacture around the world. Manufacturers therefore hoarded the chips for their higher value products, so that generated a problem in the mass market car sector, which generally slowed down activity. Then, of course, as we all know, the Russians invaded Ukraine in the beginning of or middle of the first quarter of the calendar year. That caused a spiking in most commodity prices worldwide, in addition to those supply chain problems. So specifically, the energy complex, gas and oil, and then as a secondary effect, grain prices, foodstuff prices, given that Ukraine was a major producer of grains for export around the world. Then, of course, we got a secondary effect being the sanctions placed on Russia, and here the impact further ramped up the prices of the energy complex, but also has had a secondary effect in the withdrawal by Russia of a number of supplies of fertilizer for the global market. So this year's supply of foodstuffs has been damaged by the war itself, and it's expected that next year's supply of foodstuffs will be damaged by the lack of supply of fertilizers, affecting the production of various foodstuffs. Now, we saw very dramatic peaks in energy prices. At one point, natural gas was up 600% on its year-to-date number. It's reduced now to up 50%, still an aggressive and unpleasant number, but nowhere near as bad as previously. Oil had been as much as 80% higher year to date, and it is now 28% up year to date. The big movers, though, have been metals and commodity and soft commodities, foodstuffs. Most of the global metals, both precious and industrial, are now somewhere between 20 and 30% down year to date, and foodstuff prices are more or less back to their opening gambit, with the exception of rice. So whilst there's a lag time between the generation of those commodity prices and how that then feeds through to finished products globally, we should realistically, on the back of those numbers, start to see a declining inflation picture after probably the non-wholesale gas cap or energy cap that the regulator applies to the UK consumer in October. But in the meantime, we will likely see continued rising inflation rates. The current print is 9.4% for commodity price index in the UK. The Bank of England expects that to reach 11% later this year, and I think that's probably right, plus or minus 1%. So those are the two dichotomies in the year, very aggressively borne out in the market rates. consequently, having had a very active beginning to the year 2021-22 and activity that continued pretty much through till Christmas, we've effectively I won't say shut down, but we've certainly reduced our risk profiles as aggressively as we can and are unlikely to re-establish activities in a major way until we started to see the peak of inflation pass. Economic activity was expected to continue to improve in the UK during 21-22, and that was certainly true for the first 3 quarters of the year. But again, in the final quarter of the year, we started to see a slowdown in economic activity. January activity was positive for GDP, but February and March numbers were flat or negative. Since then, we've had a slight rebound in May, but I think that's probably down to one-off factors that are likely not to persist for the rest of this year. So the big headline there is that inflation rises dramatically. How much do the Bank of England react to counter inflation, given that most of it is external inflation rather than domestic inflation? And then, given that the economy is likely to see recession later this year, how much do Bank of England interest rate rises, if they do come, make that situation worse? Could we theoretically see depression? I'm known around the team as Mr. Doom and Gloom, so my expectation is that the recession will be hard and will last longer than expected. So I think this year is likely to be a tough year for markets and for those players in the markets who are predominantly investors in fixed income securities and interest rate markets. So we're likely to see a more difficult year this year than we did in 2021-22. I think those are the economic headlines. From a positional perspective, we're now waiting pretty much month by month for Bank of England activity. Obviously, they moved again last month, and they're likely to move again for the next 1 or 2 months to at least signal their intention to try and diminish inflation. Although, what is the transmission mechanism between interest rates and inflation, given that most of it comes from external factors, and wages in the UK, which would traditionally be considered to be the internal cause of inflation, are lagging so far behind inflation. So far, obviously, we potentially see, I think, in the next 3 to 6 months, quite a lot of strike action or industrial action trying to increase the rate of pay, which will have knock-on effects potentially in inflation. But those knock-on effects are likely to appear when the commodity prices are declining, so they potentially offset each other. We've consequently had relatively little change in our overall positions, both on the debt and investment side. We still run a very low credit risk policy. The only security we have owned, which has fallen out with our general high security, high safety approach, has been our position in the Electricity de France, which had been predominantly owned by the French government, but in the recent weeks, the French government have announced that they're going to fully nationalize EDF in the next few weeks, months, and consequently, then the credit quality of that investment will rise as the security of the French state stands behind it. From a liquidity management perspective, most of our short-term securities throughout the period have been what are called floating rate securities. So the interest rate on those securities refixes on a quarterly basis. So as the Bank of England has raised interest rates, the interest that we've received on those securities has also gone up in step. So we've managed to have a relatively secure liquidity position without major reductions, or at least ways the lack of keeping a pace with our debt costs in the short term. Longer term, During the period, we accessed the bond market through the UK Municipal Bond Agency to raise £250 million worth of 40-year debt, pretty much at the low of the market. That has a running cost of 1.7% against the current cost, if we were to do it now, closer to 3.5%. We also took around just over £150 million worth of public works loan board, long dated loans, mainly in the 50-year sector, also pretty close to the lows of the interest rate cycle. So I think our average long-term debt cost now on that new debt, £350 million worth, is just under 1.79%. So we've sort of secured our short-term liquidity position by investing in floating rate notes. We've secured our long-term position by borrowing long at the close to the low point of the market, which gives us a fairly good, secure core position. Normally, one I would expect to then, using investment management techniques, look to pick up additional income through the year by managing those positions intra-month, intra-quarter. I think our ability to do that for the first 2, maybe 3 quarters of this financial year are going to be limited. So I don't expect to be producing additional income, certainly for the first half of the year, of any great scale. But I would hope that as an offset to the recession that we see, hopefully that's the wrong word, that we expect to see in the second half of the financial year, will give us then the opportunities to make those sort of returns that we normally aim for. I will leave the questions, or leave questions around the indicators to any questions that anybody have. I think they're fairly well laid out on the next to last page and the last page of the report. We stuck to our indicators, those both set out by the SIP Prudential Code and by our own internal set out. So I think we've acted judiciously during especially in the final quarter of the financial year, in what was a very difficult period. And then happy to take any questions. Sorry if that's a bit of an overload. It's been a very strange year.
In relation to the last financial year, and also your professional input in looking forward as well, so to speak. There may well be some queries or questions from members of the committee. I'll just throw this one in first of all. In simplistic terms, if we look at, I think your pages 3 and 4, overall pages 21 and 22, the respective tables on borrowing and investment, and comparing the end of March 21 with the end of March this year, I see that the borrowing went down by about 180 million, whereas the investment total went down by a lesser amount, about 110 million. So in that comparison of a difference of about 70 million, a good thing that our borrowing went down more than investments year on year.
Yes, as you may remember, Chair, back in 2020-21, and at the beginning of this financial year that we're discussing here, 21-22, because we looked to pre-borrow to a certain extent the long-term debt that we took during the period, the UK Municipal Bond Agency package and the UK Public Works Loan Board, we knew that we would then have a gradual decline in our debt position as we repaid the shorter term debt that was falling due during the period. So that's an expectation we had, and the expectation has been borne out by the eventual published figures. So I think we were expecting it to be between the order of 150 to 200 million decline in debt position. So 180 million is pretty much in the middle of that expected range. On the investment side, we've had a slightly slower reduction in our investments because of the additional monies that have come our way from central government for the various pools for COVID and other reliefs. And I don't think, Neil, we're expecting to get much clawback there, so that will be a slower decline as we see if we're expecting to see a further reduction in debt position over this financial year as well, which would again be as we had programmed. And unless there is any clawback of those COVID payments, then I would expect to see a similar picture in 22-23, a bigger reduction in debt position than the fall in investment position.
Thank you, Mike. Any observations, queries, comments?
Yes, John.
Just one question, Chair. Mike, thank you. Can you just expand on how we're going to discharge our short-term debt, which is due for maturity?
Well, because we have a fairly healthy investment position, a lot of that investment position is held in short-dated liquid securities. And as those debts fall due, if we're not planning to roll them over for specific purposes, then we would use the liquidity, the proceeds from the liquidity books to repay those loans.
Thank you.
Unless there is additional new borrowing required for any capital program activity this year.
Yeah.
I think it's last but one page, if you're not on the same as well, but the prudential indicators, there are two figures there regarding PFI schemes and long-term liabilities. The 2021-22 figure and the actual are the significant differences there. Why do we regard PFI as over risky, or was it suggested it was going to be over risky in the first? Why is there a 270 something million difference between the actual and the budget figure, and also the same on the operational boundary?
The change. Sorry, the operational boundary and the authorized limits are limits that we put in place based on, firstly, the operational boundary is what we expect the day-to-day activity to be during the given period. And then the authorized limit is usually a deal larger to account for unexplained or unexpected outcomes. Now, in the year 21-22, we were expecting that there could be financial or there could be problems with the capital markets and financing markets during that year, as we had seen the previous year when at one point the markets locked up completely just as we went into COVID lockdown. And obviously when we were setting these limits back in 2020, in the early part of 2021, there was still the expectation that there may be further COVID problems. So we left the authorized limits relatively high to allow for extraordinary circumstances or unexpected circumstances. Now, as it happens, we didn't get the sort of movements that we thought we might possibly get in extremis, which I guess is a good thing. So we've managed to operate within the operational boundary. We haven't had to use any of the additional authorized limit for protection purposes.
I think what I was trying to get at is that we see the PFI schemes as particularly risky, given the substantial figures that we've allocated against them.
No, they're generally historic. I have to correct me if I'm wrong here, Khadija. They're generally historical projects that remain outstanding. We had thought we might be able to refinance some of them during the period, but they've proved rather more difficult to refinance in what were relatively volatile markets than, for example, when we refinanced the waste PFI a number of years ago in rather more stable markets. If we return to any sort of stability in 2022-23, then I would look to revisit that situation. But at the moment, there's liquidity isn't good enough. The current holders of those contracts are loath to put a price on cancelling them, just in case they got caught in a market maelstrom and find that they can't unwind their existing liabilities. So it's just proved very difficult to do this year.
Yes, Julie.
Could I- Whilst we're talking about historical projects, obviously you mentioned waste, could you give us a few more?
I'm sorry, beg your pardon?
Could you give me some more details about the historical projects, the PFIs? I'm not aware of them, so.
Yes, sorry, neither am I. They were put in place before my arrival. The waste PFI program, we collapsed, I think, in 2013 or 2014. That was at that point a £278 million PFI project, and we negotiated with the lead bank involved in that, Lloyds Bank, to repay. I think in the end we repaid 60 pence in the pound. Sorry, you're on mute. Sorry, you're on mute. Apologies, if you can still hear me, I've lost the sound from your side.
I can hear you, Mike, but I don't think we can hear the room, can we?
No, we can't. Can you hear me, everybody? You can, okay. Do you want me to carry on, or was I getting off topic?
Okay, Mark must have heard the earlier questions, the answer.
We can hear you again now.
That's better.
Good.
Well done.
Yeah, so Neil or Katrina are going to send out to members that information that Councillor Barry has requested. Okay, is there any other queries from committee members? Mike? Okay, well, thanks very much, Mike, for that review of your report I presented, answering those questions. It was remiss me as well not to thank you. I know you thanked on the 23rd of June when you with David Green of Arling Close Limited, LCC's Treasury Management Advisors, gave that welcome presentation on Treasury Management, as I say, on the 23rd of June, on a hybrid meeting. And some members of this committee and other county councillors who aren't on this committee attended and participated. And I'm sure they, like me, appreciated that presentation and the answers you gave to questions, and also from, as I said, Arling Close's David Green. And no doubt later in this year, I noticed from the work plan that's later on this agenda this afternoon, at least we'll see you in January. I suppose if there's something pressing, you might see you before that at the October meeting, but currently it's planned to see you in January to give us an update on how the current year is turning out on Treasury Management. So thanks very much, Mark. Thank you very much.
Could I, just before I leave, just re-emphasise, as always, that if any member has any questions they wish to add, more than happy to discuss either over the phone or in person, anything that comes to your mind with regard to Treasury Management. And could I also get it on record that Andy Ormerod, who looks after the liquidity portfolios, has done a sterling job this year and has been a substantial part of the performance.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks to Andy by you for the work you just mentioned that he's been doing. Thank you. Okay, we'll now move on to agenda item 6. Another very important matter, approval of the council's statement of accounts for 2021-22, subject to external audit. This was the subject, as members may recall, of a very briefing run by Kajida. There's a hybrid meeting again. That was on Tuesday, the 12th of July, which we appreciated very much. Again, there were members from this committee and at least one county councillor who isn't on the committee attended, albeit it used to be a member of the committee. That was very useful, and it was requested and acceded to that a full copy of the statement of accounts will be sent out in advance of the agenda pack, so that those same members, or in fact all members of the committee, would have more of an opportunity to read through the document in advance of this afternoon. So that really means that Kajidi doesn't need to spend time going through every single one of the pages, certainly not, but may want to just mention some key things. One thing that Kajida may be mentioning, but I'll feel a march on it, so to speak. It's only about the date, although it is material, on page 26 of the document. It gives the date of signing, which should be today, but it inadvertently gave the date of last December. So I think I noticed in the meantime the officers have checked, have amended that particular page in the statement of account. So over to you, Kajida.
Thank you. So as been mentioned, I won't go through the details of the entire account because there's a lot in there, several hundreds of pages. However, just as set out in the covering report, the accounts were published ahead of the statutory deadline. They are currently subject to audit. Our representative from Grant Thornton is here with us. They have got a deadline for the end of November for completing the audit, and I'm sure Stuart from Grant Thornton will give you an update on whether that will be achievable this year. The accounts are, as required under the audit regulations, subject to public inspection, where members of the public can request for more details from their review of the accounts, but obviously under their provider are able to do that anyway, but it's just a further prompt for members of the public who may want to inspect specific elements of information in the accounts. So that period was undertaken and at the end ended on the 19th of July. So that's what's in the covering report. In terms of the accounts themselves, members hopefully will have had a chance to review them, and you may have found the first 30 or so pages particularly interesting. It may be a little bit more understandable than some of the more technical document elements in analysis within the accounts, and hopefully the first 30 or so pages that include the narrative report, the outturn around the balance sheet and the revenue account was your understanding, and hopefully that will form part of your decision making, I suppose, today as to you're approving the accounts. When the final audit report is available, this committee is likely to see the accounts again as a final wrap up of the accounts for the year. So I'll stop there for any questions that you may have.
Any questions or queries? Yeah.
Thank you, Chairman. Just a couple of questions, minor questions, that's all. Page 69 on the short-term debtors, where we've got council tax. Does this council tax do anything for those short debtors, or do we leave it up to the district council for repayment or court action?
So the collection responsibility is with the district councils. However, our accounts carry a provision in the event that they're not able to achieve the full value that we had budgeted for. So the collection of the actual money is with the district.
Fine, thank you. Okay. And the other one I've got is on page 105. And that is regarding the credit risk. And in the middle of the page, we have long-term of 7.1, and the credit rating gives not applicable. Could you just expand on that for me, what that meaning is? But there's no AA credit rating or treble A.
Just found the page. Are you able to repeat that question again?
Yes.
I'll have to double check. I did, we did prepare a report on audit fees outside of the committee in April. I have to refresh my memory what the difference was between the 68 is largely last year's fees, which they don't get approved by public sector audit appointments, PSAA, till about 9 months after the year end. So there's a bit of a time delay. So that 68 actually mostly relates to the additional fees from 2021. And then this year's additional fees will come into next year's accounts. And similarly, the figure in 2021 is from the year before. So I'll have to refresh my memory on what the additional was from essentially 1920 to 2021. It's largely in relation to the additional work performed on the value for money, which started last year. That was an enhanced piece of work which resulted in the annual audited report that went to full council in February. That is a
Than anything specific to do with the county council, unless Stuart corrects me on that point.
no. So the top line, that what was 87 in 2021, now 93. That is it's got a scale fee set by public sector audit appointments, and that was set in around 2017, 2018. Subsequent to that, our regulator, the Financial Reporting Council, they sort of enhanced the scope of our work and the amount of challenge they give us. The audit fees are then increased sort of relative to that additional risk placed upon us. And so that goes through as an additional fee, which PSAA still have to approve. So it still goes through their approval process, but there's a much larger time delay between that, which is where you get this situation.
Okay, Jeff, Councillor Copersway, you had your hand up earlier.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the sound just disappeared, so I didn't know whether you were calling me or not. But yeah, just going, I hope we're still on the statement of accounts.
Yes, we are.
Page 17 of the statement of accounts, or financial performance revenue summary. Yeah, certainly a hell of a read anyway. But yeah, I just wondered if we, question for Khadija, do we compare our performance with other similar councils or any councils, particularly amounts spent by service? And I was looking at the sort of the split of gross expenditure by service. For instance, taking out schools, for instance, just how much we spend on adults and children. By my calculations, about 63% of the entire budget, compared to just 10% on highways, etc. So everything else is getting squeezed. I just wondered how that compares with other councils or other bodies. Do we compare?
So the answer is yes, we do compare to other local authorities. I think the percentage of expenditure on adults and children's social care particularly is high in upper tier authorities generally, so that isn't likely to be unusual. In terms of specifically how much we spend per person or per population, benchmarking those figures, that traditionally in our council has been done as part of the budget setting process to review where there are specifically higher spending areas compared to what other authorities may be spending, and that has been the focus in the past of potentially some effort to bring that in line with benchmark. But as you can imagine, information like this generally is retrospective. So even if we are trying to catch up to a particular average across different authorities, those councils themselves will have moved on and aren't necessarily doing it right in a sense. So it doesn't take into account levels of quality and what can be afforded as well. So that it's not as straightforward as simply comparing how much we spend compared to others, but it is a feature that gets looked at as part of the budget setting process.
Okay, Neil, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I was just going to add that as part of certainly pre the pandemic, for also publishing indices in terms of this sort of information, and one of them, the key ones there, was the proportion of councils' budgets which are spent on adults and children's social care, because it's in a big risk factor, because most councils are seeing a much bigger proportion of their budget being spent in that area. But absolutely, to make sense why we do publish budget and output information to compare it, you've got to compare it per head of population or other factors rather than just simple spend, because we're all different sizes clearly on that list.
Thanks for that, Neil. Are you okay with that? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Chair, and thank you, Neil and Khadija. Certainly a comprehensive.
Can you still hear us, John? Yeah, sorry. Can you still hear
us?
Yes,
yes.
Councillor Singleton, John, you had another query on statement.
Yes, I'm sorry, Chairman. One item I omitted to ask. It's not very clear to find the values. But where can I find the values of the Section 278 monies?
I'm not familiar with that. Are you able to?
I'm usually dealing in 106 monies, which is for buildings. But there is, if a developer builds something, he will add something into the Section 278.
This is usually to do with highways work, isn't it? Required.
Yes.
Right. So it wouldn't. So the council wouldn't go into specific schemes. However, spending in the narrative report, you'll see the capital expenditure overall. So you will be able to see the planned budget around specific capital projects and how much was spent, but it won't detail specific grants that have been used for capital purposes such as.
Right. Let me just qualify that, if I may. If a developer supplies some monies under the 278 arrangements, but they're not used yet, Where would they be held in the account?
So there's a section around grants unapplied, and it'll be held on the balance sheet. So in the reserve statement, it'll identify the amounts of overall reserves and itemising the details around the reserves. There'll be a line that says.
That wouldn't be by division, would it? It would just be,
One overall
one, yeah.
council account.
okay, thank you.
That's provided, of course, that money has been
Yes,
passed over to
Yeah.
the county council. Yes, Paul?
I was just going to say, Chair, I mean, my service does deal with the section 278 money, and we do monitor that on a quarterly basis, so that information is available. So, wishes to.
I'd like to see that, yes.
Yeah, perhaps that could be arranged with Councillor Singleton after the meeting.
Yeah.
Outside the meeting, yes. Okay. Do you want to come in, Andy?
Yeah, I'd just like to highlight quickly just one addition that needs to go onto the annual governance statement on page 220 or 258, I think it is. We notified an additional piece of audit work at the pension fund, which we weren't aware of before. So if you see on page 220, we've got the audit work that's been considered LPPA. So we've just got an additional, but we're now aware of which can get added onto that table. And that was, it's the annual events audit and aggregation, and it was covering items such as the annual benefit statement and annual allowances and pension increasing processes. It was done by Deloitte for LPPA, and they've given assurance level of effective, so it's additional assurance that we weren't aware of at the time, and that was done.
Yeah, members will recall that the annual government statement was approved at the April meeting, and subsequent to that, there was some information sent out by email from Democratic Services relating to the pension fund and what's called its governance compliance statement. Some of that has been refined in the meantime, and this is a further update of that just for completeness, in that Deloitte, who were the internal auditors for local pensions partnership administration up to March 2022. Since then, internal audit is done in-house by LPPA. Deloitte are remaining the internal auditors for the rest of local pensions partnership, including LPP investments. So there was this other audit that they did. So for completeness, this page is being added to by that one that the head of internal audit has just mentioned. So that with your approval needs to be just added in before we approve the whole statement of accounts. Are there any other queries on this statement of accounts? Any observations, questions? No. So the recommendation is that the committee are asked to approve the 2021-22 statement of accounts as presented in Appendix A, subject to that matter I mentioned earlier about the date on page 26 of the approval of being today's date, and the addition in the pension fund part of the annual government statements that the head of internal audit has just referred to.
I'll propose that, Chairman.
Thank you, John. After the seconder, Councillor Clifford, thank you very much. Are we all in favour? Yes. Thank you very much. And thanks again, Kajida and your team, for your excellent work again in producing this, and other officers that have been involved. Thank you very much.
I'm sure it might say, so having issues.
I'm not sure.
Councillor Cooperthwaite, can you hear us clearly still?
Yeah, it's been fine for the last 10 minutes, thanks.
It just drops off occasionally.
I'll just say it, right. Do you mind if I just quickly check it?
Yeah, of course.
Okay. Anyway, while that IT checking is going on, we'll move on to item 7 on the agenda, response to the information request of the external auditor. This is a usual item at this time. I take it members will have looked at the Appendix A. Unless members got any queries on this, can we move to the recommendation, which is asking the committee to agree to the management responses, respective responses to this request as set out in Appendix A.
Yes, and I'll propose that again, Chairman.
Well, thank you, John. Would you like the second half?
Not seeing the gentleman,
Sorry.
sorry, interrupting. If it happens again, my number's directed to my mobile if you want to take that down. It's 01, oh yeah.
I take it we're all in agreement. Thank you very much. We'll move on to agenda item 8. This is an update that was requested at the committee meeting in April to the County Council management responses to the recommendations of the external auditor. That were in the external auditor's new development annual report that went to this committee in January and then went on to the full council in February. And there were no sort of old, what we call statutory findings. We got a clean bill of health on that, but there were these sort of advisory recommendations of which there were 5, 2 in relation to financial sustainability and 3 relating to governance. And as I remember it, at the January committee, because of the quick timescale or short timescales involved, there wasn't the management responses on there, so they were sent out afterwards to the committee and were embodied in the report that went to the full council that Stuart and the then Grant Thornton responsible partner Paul Dossett reported on verbally at that full council meeting, if members may recall, back in February. It was the budget meeting of the full council. But since then, there have been some changes involving the scrutiny arrangements that went through Cabinet and full council, because what it means is that 1 or 2 of these governance matters, I think it's one relating to scrutiny, they mentioned the then review panel needed to be tweaked, if that's the right word, because now that panel doesn't exist, and that work that panel did is now part of what the sorry about that. That wasn't my heartbeat. It's now part of what the so-called scrutiny management board does. So, having said all that, this is a useful update to the management committee on those 5 recommendations that came from it. As I said, they weren't statutory sort of recommendations. It was up to the county council whether they acted on them. On some of them, we said yes, didn't we? Or the officers did on behalf of the county council that they could be implemented to do with, I think recording gifts and hospitality and members' interests were straightforward. So the recommendation is for the members to note the updates provided. Are we okay to note that?
I'd like to make a comment.
Yes.
Yeah, just going on, referring to recommendation 3 about governance and the assumption that we think we're in a position where we're making informed decisions. I'm absolutely shocked and inspired really about the movement with the improvements we've made really following the LGA peer review and actually looking at scrutiny more and putting things in place. It's been absolutely it's the quality of life for councillors, I think, is been enhanced enormously because feel a lot more assured about things. But I've still got concerns about decision making, because there's nothing featuring around councillor first. And if we have that as an aspiration, councillor first, it's that is key to particularly local decision making. Keeping councillors informed what's going on in their districts and divisions, and what's eroded over time because we're not thinking councillor first is that you look at something we just referred to around geographies about SIL money, and we're looking at the big picture, and that is our big job to manage. But actually, for better working relationships and collaboration with our partners like districts and parishes, we need the smaller geography. And that's how we can hold things to account a lot better. Do you grasp that that it is that local information that's going to help us make better changes?
Absolutely, and that's where individual councillors come in their work as a county councillor, or indeed a district councillor if they're being happy or you're happy. But it's not necessarily, I would suggest, subject to what you and others think, for us necessarily to delve into particular, smaller geography, as you say, as you call it, or particular casework, unless it's an example of a wider, bigger issue that needs to be addressed. I don't know what other members think about that.
But that's exactly what I'm saying. I mean, it's almost like, something that doesn't get resolved in a sort of timely fashion, should perhaps be used as an audit exercise in, is something particularly working in a service?
Yeah, certainly.
But the thing is
if you've got evidence of an example that's worth drawing to our attention and to internal audit, especially if it's something that they're looking at in the audit plan that we've approved, then yeah, by all means, let's hear these examples if they're relevant to the wider application across the county council in that particular service.
Just going back to the geography, if we don't understand the geography, we don't know the geography of the things we deliver, we can't really, it's not transparent enough.
So what do you think?
So a lot of stuff involved in
knowing that wider geography, because is it not part of our role as councillors to get to know that ourselves?
No, it shouldn't be guesswork.
No,
and we should, I think there was a bit more reporting going on more regularly without having to ask, it's like a bit like this, I'll use an example, short-term policy around school places. That we review that's reviewed like twice a year, but stuff doesn't come through unless we get it once. We shouldn't have to ask for it again. But I'm more concerned about the councillor first, and that relationship with scrutiny as well.
Laura, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I understand what Councillor Berry is saying, because it's part of a very clear picture that emerged from our councillor survey. And as the report mentions, there is a small working group, and there are 2 members from the Labour group that sit on it, and we're looking at some of the issues. A lot of it does revolve around informing members about. So we are working on it, and I will keep you updated.
Right, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that. Incidentally, on the overall page 307, that last bullet point, we mentioned that the programme of scrutiny training has also been developed. There was some members will recall if they're on scrutiny committee, and I'm now on the scrutiny committee, so I do attend it. There was a local government association workshop that was been commissioned by the county council, and that was on the afternoon of Tuesday of last week. And I gathered it in the morning, but in a similar presentation by those same people for cabinet members, and it may have included lead members. And I think on the following Thursday, last Thursday, it was going to be done for scrutiny committee chairs and vice chairs as well. So that was proof that the last bullet point there was being actioned.
Could I just say it's absolutely really, really good, really absolutely excellent.
Thank you. Okay, any other comments? Okay, so we're asked to note that. I take it we're okay in subject to the comments that have been made. Thank you very much. Okay, now it's over to our head of internal audit, Andy Gillespie, just to take us through the key parts of his internal audit progress report. Again, the item 9. Over to you, Andy.
Thank you, Chair. This is the regular update that we produce this week meeting. So, as information from 30th June 2022. Provides an update on this on 2023 audit plan. Where today, on the 30th of June, we're ongoing and the 16% of the audit plan 22-23. been focused primarily on the last quarter, finishing off previous year's work plan. And from that, we finalised 18 audit reports, 6 grand of professional investigation. And we've got 2 other audits at draft reporting stage. And on that's on top of the starting with 16% of the plan. And just for information for the committee, for the external clients that we provide services to, we in that period we finished 15 audit reports, follow-ups, and 3 audits at draft. A big increase in the work that we've done, so we've made some significant inroads into completing the plans. We've also completed the follow-up review of the follow-ups and the management actions that have been outstanding, as we promised to do at the last committee. And report on that. Just like to highlight to the committee with a slight typo on the table at 4.4. It should be 30th of June 2022, not 21. But that provides a summary of what's outstanding at the moment. See, it's reduced it down to 19 management actions that are outstanding. 96 that are outstanding, but they're already scheduled for follow-up through our normal audit planning process, and a lot of them ones have been implementation dates yet have arrived. We've done this piece of work by working with managers and to get management assurance on the implementation of them, and also then looking back and cross-referencing to audit work that we've done going forward that's superseded and areas and the same issues haven't arisen. So we're able to reduce a lot of the outstanding recommendations, which we was aware possibly won't give us a true reflection at the last meeting. So this gives us a much more accurate picture. The 19 that are due for follow-up, we'll keep them completed yet. We'll keep them on the review and support services as they work through to implement them. And the 96 we'll do with our normal follow-up process to include them. So I'm very pleased that them numbers have come down quite significantly. I've jumped a little bit there actually. So the audits that we completed, the table there showing our assurance levels for the year, and we've also included this time details of the grant certification work that we've completed. Normally we'll just let you know that we do that kind of work, but I'd like to highlight the number of grants that we are doing.
That's over on page 312, isn't it?
Yes.
Over on page, yeah.
Usually what we'll do is talk about amendments to the audit plan. We haven't not suggested take anything off the audit plan at this stage, but we have been requested to do a number of additional works that weren't included in the original plan. Completed most of them with us completion. We do that to be flexible. Very pleased with the first quarter away from moved on. You'll see on the appendices so included executive summary of the works that we've done, giving an outline of the findings and the management actions that have been agreed to be implemented. Happy to take any questions on any of them.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, it's useful, as you say, you point out that appendices C to Y provide an executive summary for each audit and you use that the previous meeting, which I'm appreciating, as they will this one. Julie,
I'm just thank you very much for obviously for all the detail. It's really useful, and I say it just lends itself really well to improving the relationship with our scrutiny committees. I don't know how we can synchronise it soon. I'd have loved to have seen that before we've worked out some of our programmes for this year. So that was something to think about. You know, so it's a separate operation, but it provides valuable information for councillors. So just wish
I think it's been yeah, I'll come to Councillor Singh's done, Councillor Bailey in a moment, but yeah, it's been already said, I think, that there is a required linkage from internal audit if there's any audits that they're doing relating to a particular service, maybe scrutiny committee's work plan is looking at that, and it's important there's no lack of information between the two and no duplication of effort, etc. I think it's a useful point you've reminded us of the Councillor Berry. Do you think you can have anything on?
Yes, please, Chair, yes. Just for the committee's reference, para 4.4, page 313 of the 96 follow-ups. You've said you've got dates on them. Just qualify, are there any high-risk ones on?
Yes,
on the 96.
On the 96, yeah. There's two high risk ones, 55 medium and 39 low bio.
Yeah, thank you. And the remaining 19 follow-ups, are there any high risk on those?
Yeah,
yeah.
It's
313, yeah.
A medium of 4 low.
Thank you. And on the appendices, there's a total of 12 high risk ratings. Do we have any agreed complete dates on those 12?
Yeah, all management actions, we agree implementation dates.
Thank you, that's fine. Lovely. Just a couple more. Page 353, disclosure of bargaining service. If you can just explain this for the committee, there's 2 high risk ratings, but the overall assurance is moderate. Again, can you just explain that for us?
Yeah,
so it's one, isn't it, one high risk and 0 for the others?
I think you might, I'm sure we'll talk about one day. There's 1 high risk and 1 low bio.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, that's what we said that it may have 2 high risk ones, but end up with moderate. There are levels within each of the high.
Is that overall page 354 we're looking at?
353. Oh,
yeah. Yeah, just that it says no findings for the categories other than warning high risk.
Right, sorry.
With the moderate
Yeah.
assurance.
Yeah.
Is it because of you've looked at the overall position in assessing it as moderate? Is that right, Andy?
Yes, we look at all the risk in the whole for the area under the scope and then make that judgment of what outstanding will be high and low, and then that will inform moderate. So it's not quite black and white. We can say X amount of recommendations will class as a moderate or substantial, because there are shades of grey within that. We will look at that.
Yeah.
But there's some that can be sort of borderline moderate, and some that borderline.
No, that's fine. Thank you. And just one final one, page 404, and that's the internal mandate investigation where there's 5 high risks. And if you can just explain, there's no conclusion on that.
Yeah, that was piece of work that staff to look at and was aware that it was a near miss really for a mandate fraud, where fortunately member staff didn't follow the correct procedure, and it really related to a substantial amount of money.
It's on the 343.
It starts at 341, but it's just the scope of the audit. It's a question about that. We make sure it's doing what it should do as far as claims, or whether we're actually getting value from it out of what we do was questioned.
Yeah, so on that piece of work covered sort of the building clean strategy, budget management processes within that, and clean specifications, resource planning required to deliver the strategy, and then performance standards and monitoring and that. So I think it wasn't. So
is that picked up somewhere else?
Not on that particular piece of work.
Within the authority.
Not sure how that's it.
It will come out in some of the benchmarking work that we'll do through SIPMA, and also through any procurement process. Although, having said that, this is internally provided, so I think I'll come back to you on how we assure ourselves of money in those circumstances, if that's okay, Chair.
And the second question related to sickness absence, page 377. There was a lot of figures here, but more interesting figures left out. Really, it basically said the older people care service has the second highest sickness rate across the council. What is that? How many days a year, or a percentage? Is it just as it's within the top, I think 75%, and recorded absences? What is the rate? Yeah, what is the actual rate of sickness, or number of days per employee?
The average days of the council is 12 days per year, but it will be higher in the service because obviously that's an average.
But is that, and the sort of question is, well, how does that relate to other authorities, or is it the general population or general work population?
Chair, I know the performance report that went to, I think it was the last cabinet or the cabinet before, certainly had a breakdown of some of those statistics, but I can't recall the detail. But I'm pretty sure there was a paragraph or so in there about sickness absence.
I think it did, but I remember the 12. It was, but that is the average. This is specific. So. What the envelope is, I don't know. I decided that.
Wanted to know what the figure is for this service.
Yeah, I think it's a bit more specific on this particular service, and I think there's there's only a third of the managers have actually received the applicable training on the appropriate HR policy. Is that something that's being addressed fairly rapidly?
That's picked up as part of the recommendations, and we will follow that up. So it should be being reminded about that training, and we should be taking that on, follow that up as part.
Okay, so will this be coming back to this committee?
officers concerned with the quality of answers, and there's some follow-up information, either specifically or in a future report to the committee. So I take it we're okay to note the report. Thank you very much. Still on internal audit, agenda item 10 that we're now up to is to do with an update with regard to one particular area of the internal audit charter. So again, over to you, Andy, please.
Thank you, Chair. This is the internal audit charter for our service. We renew this and review it as and when we feel necessary. It's not necessarily an annual review. Obviously, there's been a change in my role coming in, and it was proven to look at the charter. I've gone through the charter. It's very much as it used to be. There's not a great deal of change that's needed on there. The main change, which pointed out, is section 1.2, where previously the charter got approved by the Council Corporate Management Team and then came over to this committee for approval. When we've looked at it and discussed it, the real need is for the approval of this committee, because this is where we get a lot of our quality and power from, along with come off by one officer. So we just removed that need to go to CMC. Obviously, we work closely with CMC all the time, and we their support, and we get their support to deliver what we're doing. So we've just taken that out. So if needed, it gets approved here. The charter just defines our purpose and our objectives, and gives us our authority to access records of buildings and fix these plans and when we. But with that, it's very much as it was like last time it came to this committee.
Okay, any comments from any members?
Just one question, Chair. There's no requirement for this to come to committee if there's been no changes at all, with reference to the public sector internal audit standards.
No, it doesn't need to.
Only when there's been an amendment.
Yeah.
Right. No, that's fine, thank you.
Okay. Committee to consider, which will have and to approve the internal audit charter.
Chairman.
Thank you. And Rob, you're seconding. Thank you very much, Councillor Bailey. Are we all in favour of that? We'll take it. Thank you very much. Moving on now to agenda item 11. This is over to Stuart Blasnett of John Thornton to speak to us on this external audit progress report and checklist update. Please, Stuart.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So there's not a huge amount that I want to say in addition to what is in the report. This is our usual progress report for both the County Council and the Pension Fund. There's a few areas I just want to draw out. The first one being the audit deliverables table, which is on page 434 of the agenda pack. So really just a reminder about the timeframe for the audit. So expecting to bring an audit findings report to the October committee, when the idea is the audit will be substantially complete by then. Might be a few areas outstanding, but enough to sort of have the general feel for what the audit opinion will be. With the statutory deadline as the end of November. There is an ongoing discussion with SIPA in regards to infrastructure assets, which is a potential risk to the November sign-off. We're still waiting the final response from SIPA on that. That's a national issue on infrastructure assets. Council have included a paragraph in the accounts on the current issue being discussed, but that has by and large prevented auditors from signing off prior year audits. The Lancashire was already signed off before this was an issue, but it will be an issue for this year's audit. So that is one potential risk to that deadline. Hopeful that there will be a response from SIPA relatively soon on that, but it's yet to be seen what the response will be. Following on from that, we have the auditor's annual report, which we touched on a bit earlier. It relates to our value for money work. So the requirement is for that to be completed within 3 months of the sign-off of the audit. Current plan is for that to go to the January committee, so a similar timeframe to last year. The second thing I just want to draw out is on page 435 onwards, which is the result of our interim audit work. So this is largely the work that we do on updating our understanding of the processes and controls and the key systems in place at both the council and the pension fund. So that work was completed in March and April, and there's no significant findings coming out of that work. So we've progressed on to our audit of the accounts, which we started in July. I also just would like to mention that the council did make the financial statements available to us on the 15th of June, which is a really good achievement. There's a lot of councils not in that position, and obviously it is a very long set of accounts as well, and complex. So to have that prepared by 15th of June is a very good performance indeed. And finally, the last part of our report is just sector updates and audit market, a number of reports and articles, just for information, so nothing which I plan to go through in any detail, but I am happy to take any questions, Chair.
Thank you, Stuart. Any queries, comments from members?
Yeah, just one, Chair. Thanks very much for going through that. You're right, SIPA is holding a lot of councils up regarding signing their accounts off. So let's assume we haven't got a response from SIPA, and it's come to November and the accounts are not signed off. What does that mean to this council?
It's a good question. The statutory deadline largely became more of a target than a hard deadline in recent years, due to the pressures, the additional pressures put on auditors by the FRC, our regulator, and also the complexity in accounts and how much more audit time's going in. So for last year, for example, the deadline was the end of September.
That's right.
But I think across all audit firms, there was only around 12 to 13% of audits signed off by that date. So I guess the date does have less relevance now, maybe than it has in the past, because of so many councils facing the same sort of issues.
Right.
So other than, I guess, planning of resources, because obviously, as well as the audit teams input, a lot of your finance team have to respond to our queries and challenge. Other than the timing of that, I don't envision there being any particular consequences of such of not hitting that deadline.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
In connection with that, I do recall as other members of the committee who were on the committee then, Edu, last December there was a special meeting of the committee. I think it was done by MS Teams to authorise after the external audit had been completed, authorise the accounts after they've been audited. That if it need be, that could be done again. If it's required. I noticed on page 5, overall page 433, there's a section about audit fees, and the third of the 4 paragraphs mentions about the impact of changes that are mentioned above, both on the cost and timing of audits have been reviewed, and discussions are going to take place on what that might mean for the scale fee set by PSAA Limited that we signed up with. And I gather that maybe, as a result of that, maybe some figures coming to the October meeting of this committee.
Yes, so similar to the report which I was going to recirculate on the 2021 fees, there'll be a similar extract in our October report setting out, itemising each of the additional fees which we are proposing, which have to be approved by.
I can't hear you. I can see you all looking at me though.
are in part 2 of the agenda. So they're counter-terrorism and cyber security. So they're picked up at item 18 later on in the agenda. So if there's any comments or questions on those 2 particular risks, we'll take them later on in the meeting. Also, just to note, at the last meeting, the committee asked about LCC risks relating to the pension fund. And I can inform the committee that 3 risks have been added to the Resources Directorate Risk Register, and they're monitored quarterly. And again, there's a short paragraph at the bottom of page 446, which covers that particular issue. And the Director of Finance, Neil Chiswick, is the risk owner for those particular risks relating to the pension scheme.
Thank you, Paul, for pointing those 2 things out, including that those 2 risks you mentioned dealt with further in part 2, so we need to just reserve any comments on those until we get to that situation of the agenda. Any comments at all on this update? Yes. No.
I'm not sure how relevant it is to do with school places and the move to academisation. That there's no mention of that in there. I understand that the overall number of places may stay the same unless we change it, but the academisation is likely to change the management of substantial numbers of schools, which is going to, I would have thought, cause at least some teething problems in the early stages.
Yeah, and I mean, it may well do. I mean, I suspect that we will pick that up as part of that particular risk later on in the year when we know a bit more about that particular issue and this sounds the
Could I just say it's more the risk to house building applications going through on safeguarded land in most areas, which are pushing not good places under real pressure.
I know it's down to scrutiny in October, this particular issue around school places.
Incidentally, it was interesting on academisation. It's the briefing on the statement of accounts the other week that was mentioned earlier. There was a discussion that developed on academisation. And I just can't tell you which pages are on now. If I know it's within the other part of the statement of accounts, there is information on which schools have become academies during that last financial year. And also there's a supplementary note about some that have become academies since 1st of April this year until the publication of these statement of accounts. So there is that reference in there. If there's no other comments on this portal update of the corporate risk and opportunity register, take it we're okay to note it. Thank you very much. Here I come to agenda item 13. This is the committee chairman's annual report. That's largely from me. And this was introduced a few years ago. For I suppose more good reasons at the time, which presumably still apply. So the committee can account for the areas that it's been looking at and delving into by its work plan in the last year. Any particular key issues that are worth mentioning in this. I'm grateful for Paul Bond to have drafted this. I made the mathematical one or 2 suggestions, which is embodied. So I'm glad to answer any comments you might have on it, which of course I'll have to answer myself. So it's the chairman's report.
Yeah, as you say, Chair, this was introduced a few years ago as part of the review of the effectiveness of the committee.
Oh, right, yes, it was indeed, wasn't it? Any comments or queries?
Yes, Matthew.
Just one, Chairman. It mentions about membership, meetings and attendance, but doesn't really give any details on that in the sense of who the members have been during the year and what their attendance was. That may not be a helpful thing to include in future reports.
Appointments of the table of potential
Yeah.
attendances and how many people actually attended.
Well,
Well, I know, possibly, but I suppose,
the highest possible standard of scrutiny should probably apply to this committee. No,
yeah,
so
it's
it's just a thought.
but it's usually the case, as it's been the case with yourself today, standing as a substitute, that we try to ensure that if someone can't attend, then there is a substitute, albeit that one of our members of this committee hasn't attended today, there isn't a substitute for him, which is, well, not a good thing. Don't know what other members think. Would that be a useful innovation in this report in the future, do you think? You're shaking your head, Julian.
It's comical. I should like to think. Well, again, I won't be named and shamed for not being here. I think there's other.
It's not so much that, it's more a question of transparency as to who the membership is made up of. Just because if we're charged with, not that I am at the moment, I mean, we're charged with scrutinising all this, which is terribly important, as Councillor Clifford quite rightly said. It strikes me as being perhaps an additional layer of transparency. You might like to consider in subsequent annual reports.
Without necessarily naming the missing people, do you mean?
At your discretion, Chair, I would think on that, but I think it's probably useful to know. It just seems a little bit the statement that comprises 8 elected members representing.
Okay, perhaps Paul, we should consider this, at least consider it for next time.
Consider.
Councillor Bailey, I'll give you the point.
Is attendance not already on the recorded on the main website?
If that would, sorry, Chairman, through you, that would require a bit of detective
I
work.
think it's already there, isn't it?
I just think it would require, sorry, Chair, through you again, it would require a bit of detective work to work all that out. And it strikes me it might be, again, with an element of transparency.
Well, gosh, well, my question was, who's this intended for? Who's the recipient for this? Is it council, is the public?
Both. I mean, it's primarily for the committee to look back over the work that they've done over the last 12 months. Yeah.
Made by what?
But obviously it's on the public agenda, so it's again in terms of transparency, it's there for anyone to read.
I'd just like to make a comment. It's just a huge relief that staff have been.
I take it we're okay to note this report, subject to that.
Yes.
Thank you very much. Right, agenda item 14, draft work plan 22-23 of this committee. The officers have drawn this up, knowing what items matters usually come up. Not only of this committee, which is short for today's date, which we are covering, but also future meetings going up to including April next year. An item should draw your attention to, it's not particularly mentioned in a coding report, but at the October meeting, you'll notice it mentioned under legal and governance column an additional item known as the annual RIPA report. Perhaps Laura, the Director of Corporate Services, will fill the committee in, so to speak, as she has with me already, so to speak, why this is coming up and what it relates to.
Well, the RIPA is the Investigatory Powers Act, and it covers covert activity on the part of the council in connection with their prosecutorial function, training standards, in other words, and we're obliged to report back on that to members. It used to be to scrutiny, but we felt it was probably better placed audit, risk and governance, because the function of the committee is not to look at the prosecution of the detail of the governance and the safeguards that we have in place. So just to give you in case you're disappointed in October, we do very, very little. And 9 times out of 10, the request is to change some of our policies rather than any report on activity. So don't get too excited in advance.
You see at the October meeting as well that when the corporate finance does the requested from our last meeting update on the overpayment of salaries. And in January, as I mentioned earlier, when Mike Jensen was present, albeit remotely, there'll be an update from him on treasury and management activity in the current year at the 30th of January meeting. And also you'll see, this is another new thing for this committee, is it not? Although it's looking ahead to April, on the legal and governance, we've got the local member grant scheme that started in January. In fact, it started again in January of 22. So it was the last quarter of 21-22 is involved, as well as the whole of 21-23 in the reissue scheme of that name. There was a sort of monitoring, if you like, feedback role, this committee included. So that's what that will be all about, is it not? Any comments at all from members? Yes, Councillor Mark.
Thank you, Chair. It's just on RIPA, and it's only just because it's something I see at district level when we do our governance meetings, that every meeting there is a RIPA report, and it's always comes back as no application received. However, this one's seen in annual. Is it not worth being quarterly? I'm not good. It's just one of those things, and nothing, as you say, hardly ever comes up. But I'm just thinking, because of its importance, rather than annual, should it actually be reported on quarterly?
Well, we've always done it annually, and sometimes, as you say, it's a nil report. In fact, mostly it's a nil. So I think it would be as easy for us to give you a nil report quarterly as annually. The only problem with some of the reports is there are ongoing investigations, and our reports are invariably in part 2. So, you know, I'm not sure if we've got any ongoing at present, but we do it annually so as we don't sort of compromise ongoing investigations.
I suppose there could be something ongoing at the end of the year, and so don't know what members think. Should we keep? We could talk about that, I suppose, again when it comes up at the meeting, when we see the annual report at the October meeting. It might be worth just revisiting that to see whether you want to keep it annually or change it to quarterly. Perhaps we could think about that when that report is presented at the next meeting, if you're okay with that.
Good. Yeah.
Okay, there's no other comments. Are we okay to note this draft work plan? Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. Okay, item 15 was to do with have there been any urgent business items? The answer is no. Not. Date of next meeting is Monday the 17th of October at 2 p.m.
the venue in the council hall to be advised. And maybe going back to the second floor, because the technology, I think, will have been improved about then, if we do have a hybrid meeting, I think as you will be, subject to COVID, but it would be expected to be an in-person meeting if we can manage that, we'll see near the time. And now we've got exclusion of the press and public because of 2 items in part 2, so we need to have that arranged for us, please.